You may have heard in the news recently that the Biden administration is investing $1.2 billion in so-called vacuums that suck carbon from the sky. Frankly, this idea sounds amazing, and removing carbon from the atmosphere will solve a lot of problems. But is it all it's hyped up to be? Firstly, what are these magical carbon vacuums? Carbon capture and storage is a way in which you can capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it underground. Many companies are working on different ways of doing this, but the main way they capture carbon dioxide is through a process called direct air capture. Put simply, direct air capture is where a bunch of fans suck air through a tube with chemicals in it. This starts a chemical reaction that separates the carbon from the rest of the air. The carbon is then collected and stored using a host of processes. Or at least, this is how it's supposed to work. Direct air capture, and carbon capture in general, has repeatedly failed to work as promised at scale. Now, most new technologies need time and investment to become effective, but direct air capture is incredibly expensive. Most of the projects so far have wasted huge sums of money on carbon capture schemes that don't work, instead of spending this money on proven climate solutions. Additionally, billions of dollars have already gone towards carbon capture projects in the US alone, and they still show no signs of success. For example, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 dedicated $3.4 billion for the research and development of carbon capture projects. Of the 11 planned projects, only 2 are still operational. Since then, repeated efforts to jumpstart carbon capture have only resulted in plans being scrapped and money being wasted. Another problem with carbon capture is that it can be used as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels. In many instances, oil companies have leveraged their usage of carbon capture systems attached to their power plants to show how clean and green they are. Many times, they have been allowed to drill more because of this, even though the carbon capture systems didn't work. For example, American Electric Power attempted to capture the CO2 emissions from one of their coal electric power generators in West Virginia. After receiving over $16 million from the U.S. Department of Energy, they canceled the carbon capture project because it would be too expensive to become functional, even after the Department of Energy offered to shoulder half of the cost. Similarly, Basin Electric proposed capturing the carbon from one of their coal power plants in North Dakota, but canceled the project because it would be too expensive, despite $400 million in potential federal funding. Remember, both of these projects kept emitting carbon. The emissions did not stop when the carbon capture plants were canceled. Until May of 2020, there was only one functional carbon capture plant in the United States. The Petronova plant was praised for showing the country what was possible with carbon capture. When fully operational, the Petronova plant managed to capture over 90% of the carbon emissions from the coal-burning plant it was attached to, but the plant was frequently offline due to technical failures. In fact, over 3 years of operation, Petronova had 294 days of non-weather-related unplanned outages. In total, the carbon capture plant only operated at an estimated 69% of full functionality and was canceled after just 4 years because of high costs. Wind power could have generated the same amount of energy with zero emissions for $680 million less than the Petronova project. Petronova proved that direct air capture was possible, but not economically feasible. And this isn't exclusive to the United States. In Australia, oil giant Chevron was allowed to open a new gas extraction and processing plant because it promised to capture and store 80% of the carbon emissions the plant released during the extraction process. With a huge budget, including $60 million in federal funding from the Australian government, it built the world's largest carbon capture plant. 5 years later, in 2021, it was discovered that the plant had only captured 30% of what it was supposed to, which was only 24% of the gas extraction site's overall emissions. Also, the processing part of the plant, which contributed over half of the site's overall emissions, was never required to have its carbon emissions captured. This means that the government allowed a new gas development based on the promises of a carbon capture technology that only ended up sequestering 12% of the plant's overall emissions, meaning the government wasted a ton of money while still contributing tremendously to climate change. Similarly, oil giant Shell added a carbon capture system to one of their high-emitting projects in Canada. This system was supposed to capture over 90% of the facility's emissions. Shell was repeatedly praised for paving the way forward with their carbon capture technology and showing how we could continue using fossil fuels without heavily contributing to climate change. Unsurprisingly, an investigation by the watchdog group Global Witness found that the plant had only captured around 48% of the facility's emissions in its 7 years of operation. The amount of carbon that Shell said they would capture but didn't equals the annual emissions of 1.2 million gas-powered cars. Now, it's important to note that the carbon capture that the Biden administration is funding is not directly attached to any specific fossil fuel plants to reduce their emissions. Instead, its goal is to reduce carbon in the atmosphere overall. But that doesn't mean it won't be used as an excuse for more drilling. I use these examples because up until this point, large-scale carbon capture projects have only really been used in conjunction with fossil fuel projects. This is because fossil fuel companies are willing to shoulder some of the cost if it means they can keep drilling. But if the companies with the most to gain from industrial direct air capture mechanisms can't make it work, will anyone else be able to? If direct air capture and similar carbon capture schemes don't work, are there other technologies that might? Usually non-industrial carbon capture schemes have some sort of natural element. The most common one is to plant more trees. This is a good idea, but it's a little more complicated than that. If you plant the wrong trees in the wrong place, or you plant them and don't check back to make sure they've survived, they won't have a positive impact. Sometimes this even has a negative impact, as trees planted in places where they wouldn't naturally grow can mess up local ecosystems. Additionally, trees sequester a lot of carbon, but they need plenty of time and space to do it. Tree planting can be hugely beneficial when done well, but it alone cannot solve our problems. One study found that there isn't enough land on Earth to plant the number of trees needed to sequester the carbon we've added to the atmosphere. Another natural solution people often mention is algae, since it can sequester large amounts of carbon dioxide. This does seem promising, but research is still in its infancy, so we shouldn't count on it or similar schemes. The best thing we can do to sequester carbon is to try to undo the harmful impact we've had on natural areas. Nature rehabilitation, which includes planting trees, but also planting grasses, shrubs, and a host of other plants, as well as reintroducing animals to their native ranges and letting rivers flow free of dams, can sequester large amounts of carbon. Restoring natural areas also makes the area around them more resilient to other effects of climate change, such as providing a cooling effect during heat waves or preventing floods and landslides during downpours. We also need to better protect healthy natural areas, since it's a lot easier to keep ecosystems from collapsing than it is to restore devastated ones. Another way to use plants to sequester carbon is through regenerative agriculture. The industrial monoculture operations that supply most of our food today are terrible for the environment. They contribute to air and water pollution and climate change and strip natural nutrients from the soil. If we shift our agricultural system to regenerative agriculture or permaculture, we can make farms more resilient while sequestering carbon. This won't undo all of the fossil fuels we've already dumped into the atmosphere, but it can help. I have a lot of inner conflict over direct air capture and similar carbon capture systems. I really want them to work like I imagine they could. It would make things so much easier. Also, we are going to need some form of carbon capture, since the carbon already in our atmosphere is causing terrible climate events. I wish direct air capture and similar industrial carbon capture projects were the perfect solution to all of our problems, but they simply aren't. We need a host of solutions, from sustainable agriculture to ecosystem restoration. And if other forms of natural carbon capture like algae end up working, we should use them too. Perhaps even direct air capture has a small part of this future. But we need to diversify our options, and we need to choose carbon capture solutions that uplift people and the planet and help tackle the problems at the root of climate change. This is where my main problem with the Biden administration's recent decision to fund direct air capture operations comes in. We must weigh this funding against all of the other climate helping or hurting decisions this administration has made. While I don't like that this recent $1.2 billion investment all goes towards direct air capture, I recognize that the administration has made efforts to increase environmental conservation and sustainable agriculture, though I do wish there was more of both of those. But along with these beneficial measures, the administration has opened up new oil drilling from Alaska to the Gulf of Mexico. This makes the recent carbon capture decision seem like a goodwill grab. If Biden had refused to offer any new oil and gas permits throughout his presidency, if he had fully stood up to the fossil fuel industry and fought for our planet, the carbon capture decision could be seen as research trying to make a potential solution work. But his past actions to increase fossil fuel production show that this funding for carbon capture is just a cover-up, a half step to make up for past wrongdoings. It shows that he will use this carbon capture funding as an excuse to continue drilling, just as Chevron, Shell, and many other fossil fuel companies have. If we want these misdeeds to end, we need to show the administration what the voters want. We need to protest in the streets in large numbers to show that we care about our future. In mid-September, there will be climate change action demonstrations across the country. If you're in school, the annual global school strikes are on Friday, September 15th this year. So join a school strike near you or start one at your school. For everyone else, there will be peaceful protests across the country on Sunday, September 17th, with the main event being held in New York. Please find an event near you. Politicians want to stay in power. If we protest in large enough numbers, it will be clear to them that they must support real climate action to be elected again. Let's show them that we are not giving up on our future.